Edward waited for weeks, but no letter from Father Johnson arrived, and the occultist had to assume that the old man had failed in defeating or even confronting the demon. The unsettling thought of telling Satan about the failure left a bitter taste in Edward's mouth, as if the rough nights weren't enough strain already. Concluding that there was no cure for his unusual state of mind, which had started torturing him the past weeks, Edward had stopped trying to recover. Instead, he had started to do his work as he did before. He helped people seeking consultation from him about paranormal occurrences and followed his regular schedule when it came to important meetings. Mr. Cooper's wife had successfully recovered and earned the head of the family a reputation that he was even greater than the late Aidan Calderwood. Yet fame and applause did little to improve his personal situation. The days seemed dark and grey altogether. Crisp winds and dead leaves only increased his depression that came with the missing sleep. Mr. Hetz had often remarked how haggard Edward had started to look, a concerned comment which was greeted with Edward lashing out in his paranoia. He feared someone could see him as weak and take advantage of his condition. As a result, his servant had stopped talking more than was necessary, and even if they talked, conversations were brief and without warmth. Edward shivered on his desk as the last sunbeams faded. The mansion had grown cold since the occultist had fallen out with the man who cared for his home. Hallways had grown dark, rooms had become silent, and all Edward had achieved was more loneliness. The whispers never stopped, they even echoed in his ears in the day, and the sensation of being watched let his skin constantly prickle. He had stopped turning around and demanding from the entity to show itself, but the eerie feeling never left him, leading to him being on guard all the time. Edward tried to concentrate on the new spell he was researching. His thoughts, however, were in turmoil. It was a storm that raged in his mind. He felt confused, afraid, alone. But most important of all, he couldn't name the reason, no matter how much he thought about it. The moment he seemed to have the answer inside his grasp, it slipped away, leaving him with nothing but lingering anxiety. The candle next to him suddenly flickered ferociously. The sudden movement startled him. He stared into the bright flame, illuminating his desk and notes. Time seemed to stand still as his heart gradually slowed down again. The fire seemed so warm, so welcoming in this cold world. Cold and cruel was the life he led, but wasn't it his own doing? The mansion could be a happy place now, with Dean and Melissa living in it, with Mr. Hetz bringing tea and talking in his usual respectful and yet open manner. "What am I doing, Aidan?" he sighed. "Is the protection of the country worth the betrayal?" He looked at the ceiling as if the Lord would give him an answer. Naturally, nothing answered, at least nothing divine. As if being blown out, the candle suddenly died. Smoke and darkness filled the room. The wind outside rattled the window. Without delay, the familiar paranoia took hold of Edward. The gaping darkness seemed to want to swallow him, and the wind made the impression of an invisible force trying to get in. Edward got up as his eyes had adjusted to the darkness and let his gaze swipe through the room. He saw nothing, and yet goosebumps covered him from head to toe. Shaking his head at the ridiculous behavior, he turned to search for the matchsticks. A deep, guttural, yet screeching voice made him stop amidst his movement.
"Perish, betrayer."
In one hasty motion, Edward turned towards the window. Cold sweat covered him as two red orbs, like burning coals, probably eyes, looked back. A shadow blacker than the night surrounded the glowing circus. It didn't have a solid shape. The contours shifted and blurred, making it impossible to say what was staring at him. "Dean," Edward managed to say as his legs started shaking. He was certain his nephew had found out and was now hell-bent on getting retribution. It was the only explanation. Demons had to be summoned. They couldn't enter the earthly plane on their own. Everyone with knowledge about magic knew that. It was one of the 2 ground rules. Demons had to be summoned, and angels never interfered. Slowly the shadow grew menacingly large. The fires of hell seemed to burn in those eyes. What had Dean told the entity? Had it been tasked to drag his uncle's soul to hell? That way Dean could have made a deal without fearing for his own. His mind was hurled back into the present when the demon suddenly charged. Crying out in alarm, Edward jumped to the side, covering his head with his arms. For a moment only his own rapid breathing sounded in his ears. He still shivered, but the heavy atmosphere had disappeared. Cautiously he got up and looked around. The entity was gone. With shaking hands, Edward lit the candle and made for the kitchen. Hidden in one of the many cupboards stood a bottle of whiskey. Edward usually didn't drink. He had never felt the urge to. Only as an act of courtesy, when his host would offer a glass he would accept. But after practically seeing his fate, Edward Calderwood longed for something to take the edge off. His heart started racing at every creaking sound the building made occasionally. Ascending the old stairs felt like an eternity, with him stopping to still his breath and listen every few seconds. Back in his room, he sat down and poured a glass, which he promptly emptied. After a second glass, his head felt calm enough to think. What he needed was protection. So he drew a symbol of protection on the floor of his room. He jumped to his feet when he saw a motion from out of the corner of his eye. He emptied another glass upon assuring himself of being completely alone. Edward woke with a massive headache the next morning. The half-empty bottle stood on the table as he had left it last night. Yet apart from the dull throb, the occultist felt splendid. The alcohol had granted him the needed sleep, and he felt refreshed after a long time of restlessness. He took a moment to listen to his surroundings, but the persistent whispering was gone. Had it been just a bad dream? Hallucination? A knock sounded on the door, to which Edward replied, granting the person entrance. Mr. Head peeked suspiciously into the room, holding a cup of tea. "A letter has arrived. Shall I bring it to your room?" The man spoke in a reserved manner, placing the cup on the table. Edward noticed the disapproving glance towards the bottle. "No, leave it in the living room, please." Edward tried to speak softly, but his throat was dry. Upon walking towards the door, Mr. Head asked in a slightly concerned voice, "Is there anything else I can do?" "No." Edward shook his head. He felt miserable all of a sudden for losing control the other day. "Jacob," he started, looking up at the butler, who had turned around. Hopeful expectation marked the other man's expression. Edward tried to speak the words which would mend the bond between them, yet they wouldn't come, as the burden of what he had done to Dean filled his mind. Jacob Hatz, the man who had served their household for decades with unwavering loyalty, had no idea about what had really happened to the son of Aidan Calderwood. How could Edward look him in the eye and make peace by apologizing when another betrayal was part of the words he spoke every day? Afraid to choke on the sentence, the occultist abandoned the idea. Instead, he said, "There are more important matters than me. Don't let my problems keep you from doing your work." Mr. Head seemed to get the hint, for he replied solemnly, with all the hope vanished from his face, "I am tasked with caring for this mansion and its inhabitants, sir, and I will continue with that, even if you think it to be in vain." Alone, Edward remained sitting on the bed, his face covered by his hands. He took a deep breath, trying to keep new exhaustion at bay. Once in new clothes, he went down to read the letter. It turned out to be from Father Johnson. With an apology, the priest informed how he had confronted the demon in Italy. He also mentioned Dean using magic to free the demon and fight Father Johnson, which resulted in him failing and losing his means to predict the demon's next destination. Yet he promised to follow the trail as his duty commanded. Immediately Edward felt his stomach lurching as he remembered the demon from the previous night. It had to be his nephew's doing. He must have somehow found out about the seal, and God knew what he was going to do to his uncle. The occultist sat down, feeling sick. With skill like the one Dean inherited, there would be no safe haven. But another thing circled in his thoughts. What was his nephew doing in Italy? If it would have been anyone else, Edward might have discarded it as a simple decision without any deep meaning, but not with Aidan's son. Dean was up to something that could be harmful to Edward's plan. He just knew it. The old paranoia started coursing through him once again, even stronger than before. Now that Father Johnson had failed, there was only one good solution to finding out more and taking care of the problem. Not waiting a moment longer, Edward went down into the cellar. The underground hallway seemed suddenly gloomier and more sinister than before. Hearing nothing but his own footsteps, Edward tried to not think of anything in his frail mental state. Yet his imagination ran free, showing him glimpses of what could wait in the shadows. Upon entering the room he used to summon demons, he closed the door. A deep growl let him turn around. Waving with his lantern, he peered into the darkness, but there was no one there. With shaking hands he lit the candles. The flickering flames cast shadows at the walls, figures with distorted proportions and menacing teeth. Making himself ready for the act of magic, Edward took a deep breath. Satan appeared, looking as confident and imperious as always. The red eyes demanded Edward to speak quickly and about important things. Father Johnson has lost the trail. Edward spoke with as much superiority as he could muster. That is unfortunate, the devil replied, showing no emotion. But he will. Edward was cut off when Satan continued in a, for him, soft voice. You seem pale. Anything the matter? Edward didn't know anymore if it was a trick or genuine interest. The maddening fear and paranoia had sunken into his very bones, corrupting his soul. He knew how much it already impaired his judgment, yet without taking action he was sure to face his end, one way or the other. And so he took a leap of faith. After all, what could Satan do as long as Edward kept him confined in the circle? My nephew is with your demon. I have reason to believe he is after my life. I can see how it troubles you, the devil answered with something that seemed to be sympathy. Edward wasn't sure if his mind played tricks on him, but the creature in front of him seemed to show emotion. You are an important man to me, and I wouldn't like you to leave this world so soon. Satan soothed, sparking to life a new hope inside of the occultist. Holding out one of his hands, the entity offered Edward 2 shiny black stones. Edward was reluctant at first, but the patience with which the devil upheld his offer made him relax. Edward took the stones, which were as burning hot as the glass had been, and wrapped them into a cloth. They were not much bigger than 2 small pebbles, yet the weight led Edward believe the stones were made of something even heavier than lead. He had to force his eyes off the perfect objects, which emanated some strange aura. What are those? Edward asked, downright dumbfounded. Satan put his hands behind his back again before speaking. They are instruments to control demons. Summon a demon, and once he says his name, it will be engraved on the stone, and he will obey without a circle. If not, the stone will ensure he does. Edward's heart faltered for a moment. Where's the catch? The devil smiled at the very question. There is none. Every alarm still working inside of the occultist rang to life in that instant. Satan must have noticed, for he continued in his warm voice. You don't have to use them, but if you want to live without fear, the entity cast Edward a meaningful look. Then you need power. Edward's mind reeled. Power was what he wanted, wasn't it? He had worked so long for this, just to get it delivered on a silver plate. There's only one thing. The entity raised its index finger. I need you to take care of the demon. I think I know what he's trying to do. You have to hunt him in the mortal world. I will take care of the other realms beyond. I don't know where he is, but I do." With those words, Satan descended back into hell, blowing out half the candles in the process. Edward looked at the cloth in his hand once again. The power tried to lure him, but his rational mind warned of danger. He would not use them, not right away at least. No demon, and definitely not the devil, would grant him power out of benevolence. Satan was trying to trick him, to seduce him, like he did with Eve in the garden. But Edward knew these tricks, and he would not fall for them. A terrifying sound made him look up in alarm. At the wall opposite of him, a grotesque, shadowy face could be seen. Though its eyes did not shine red, the occultist knew what it was. Opening its mouth, revealing crooked, shadowy teeth, a yawning sound escaped its throat. Panic gripped Edward tightly. His legs started shaking, disobeying the command to stay still. Swiftly he extinguished all the candles but the one in the lantern. Not checking if the creature was gone, Edward opened the door and made a dash for his own room. Reaching safe haven, he locked the door and sat down in the protection spell he had woven. A look outside the window revealed a dark sky sprinkled with stars. It was a ghostly atmosphere outside, like every Samhain. Edward placed the lantern next to him on the floor. He would not sleep until the first morning light. He didn't dare to. Not at the night when the spirits roam free. What if the demon would get stronger and break the spell? It would gut him in his sleep. Edward's teeth started chattering, although the room was warm. Slowly he started rocking back and forth, fear paralyzing his entire being. But he would not use the stones. He had to stay strong. But what if? What if?